On a cold January evening in 1726, William Griffin, a 43-year-old upholsterer, was strolling down Saffron Hill. He was going to a place that he knew very well. He'd lived there for 18 months previously, and he'd been back many times since. He was going to a place where he could meet other men like himself, and they could get drunk, sing songs, watch a drag act, and if he was lucky, engage in some sexual shenanigans. William was going to a molly house, and he was going to the biggest molly house in London. But this evening, the place he was going to would suddenly be thrust into the full glare of public exposure as a sex scandal rocked London. Griffin left Saffron Hill and went on to Field Lane. Field Lane no longer exists. Most of this part of London has changed, but back then it was a confusing warren of side alleys and back streets. William knew exactly where he was going. He's going to Margaret Mother Clapp's Molly House, a prototype gay club, if you like, one of the largest in London, a bed in every room, and every night 30 or 40 men entertaining themselves there. There they receive drinks of huckle and buss, a drink made of gin and ale. And Margaret Clapp herself, she sounds like the prototype fag hag, laughing boredly and lasciviously at the jokes and the banter behind the bar. It sounds like a great night out. That night, Margaret's house was raided by members of the Society for Reformation of Manners, and the resulting scandal and public exposure thrust her house into the limelight. Now, in 1707, an article had already been published which threatened to expose the molly houses, but it faded into the subconscious. But this time was different, and Londoners began gossiping and fearing suck-pricked hobbardy-hoys and swarthy buggerantos in what we would call a very modern moral panic. Molly houses were part of a huge landscape of choice for gay men at the time. Relative to its size, there are more gay venues here than at any other point in London's history. Men could go to masquerade balls where cross-dressing was common and gender expectations were flirted with and played with. They could go to bagnios and bathhouses or cruising grounds like Covent Garden and Moorfields. And molly houses themselves came in all shapes and sizes. Private rooms in the Red Lion in Soho, to a big house in Holborn, to Margaret Clapp's herself. And there they might meet such luminaries as the bargeman who liked to be called Fanny Murray, the coal heaver who liked to be called Lucy Cooper, or the smith who went by the name Kitty Fisher. So who were these societies for the reformation of manners who raided Margaret's house that night? They were self-appointed guardians of public decency and morality, a kind of posse of outraged Daily Mail readers, if you like. And for the last 30 years, they had believed that Britain, and London in particular, was increasingly becoming a new Sodom. Sex was seemingly everywhere, from prostitutes cavorting openly on streets. St. Paul's had become the centre of pornography. Daniel Defoe lamented that we seem to be gripped by this vice that we should be ashamed of. And the societies for the reformation of manners were determined in any way or place that they could to stamp it all out. So what did the members of the Society of Reformation of Manners find when they raided Margaret's house that night? The scenes shocked them. Nearly 50 men having a party, some of them sitting on each other's laps and kissing, some of them dressed as women, 8 or 9 of them dancing obscenely to a fiddler. Again, sounds like a great night. But this partying and this celebration was only a tiny part of what went on in the molly houses. The rest, behind closed doors, was very surprising. Molly houses enabled the men who went there to cock a snook at wider societal values. Fake birthing ceremonies would take place, where men dressed up as women, a midwife, an expectant mother, would recreate the female labour experience in all its agonies and ecstasies until a little wooden doll was born. Fake wedding ceremonies between its members allowed men to express love for each other that was forbidden in the outside world. Rituals such as having a glass of gin thrown in your face when you entered, or the language that was used. You saucy queen, madam, you little pullet, bonded this group together and formed and coalesced this subculture, and in the process created a prototype gay identity. Let's hear from one of the actual reports itself. It would be a very diverting scene to behold them in their clubs and cabals mimic nature so exquisitely. How they assume the air and affect the title of Madam or Miss Betty or Molly, etc. With a chuck under the chin and, "Oh, you bold pullet, I'll break all your eggs," and then frisk and walk away to make room for another, who thus accosts the affected lady with, "Where have you been, you saucy queen? If I catch you strolling and caterwauling, I'll beat the milk out of your breast, I will so," with a great many other expressions of buffoonery and ridiculous affectation. So what happened to the people arrested at Margaret Clapp's house that night? Margaret herself was found guilty of running a bawdy house, fined 2 marks and put on the pillory at Smithfield, where she was treated so harshly by the crowd that she fainted twice. She was sentenced to Newgate Prison for 2 years and disappears from the historical record. 3 of the men, Gilbert Lawrence, Thomas Wright and William Griffin, who we met at the start, all paid the ultimate price for their sexuality as they were sentenced to death and hanged at Tyburn in front of a baying crowd. But prosecutions and executions were incredibly rare. Only 5 more men would be executed for the crime of sodomy for the rest of the 18th century. And the 500 men who were arrested for it across the whole of that century makes the 400 prostitutes and the 600 of their clients who were arrested in the 1720s alone an insignificant number. So to be arrested and then executed for the crime of sodomy was incredibly, incredibly unlucky. Even if a man was arrested and prosecuted, the presentation of his wife and children, or the excuse that he was drunk and would never do it again, would often let him get off. And it points to a surprising sexual fluidity, which looks very modern to our eyes. The terms homosexual and heterosexual were not coined for another 150 years. So men and women who were looking for sexual encounters with their same sex would have those encounters and then wouldn't have a label to put on themselves. They didn't consider themselves gay or straight. How could they? And there are other things which seem surprisingly modern. The fact that molly houses had been recorded since the 13th century and had lived cheek by jowl with Londoners. The lack of executions and prosecutions, the fact that this scandal dies down pretty quickly, points to a tolerance of Londoners and a city that was already cosmopolitan and diverse with disparate groups of people forging their own lives ahead. But molly houses were much more than just places of entertainment which cocked a snook at wider society. For the men who went there, they were instrumental in helping form a new subculture, which we would recognise today as a gay subculture. And they were instrumental in helping new sexual identities being formed. It's ironic that the sudden exposure of the molly houses led to a realisation of their locations, which for lots of men who didn't know where they were, they now certainly did know where they were, and they could go and experiment and investigate for themselves. And there's a continuity with these molly houses right up until the underground drinking establishments in London until 1967, when gay sex is decriminalised. But perhaps we should leave the final word to the mollies themselves in a song that was an anthem for them back in those heady days of the 1720s. Let the fops of the town upbraid us for our unnatural trade. We neither value man nor maid. In our own selves we'll be free. In our own selves we'll be free.